The air lay heavy over the land, thick and suffocating, saturated with the damp breath of the Mississippi River and the sickly sweetness of crushed sugar cane. It was a Louisiana morning in 1850, when the sun had barely risen, yet already threatened a day of merciless, sweat-soaked labor. The cicadas had begun their relentless shrill chorus, a sound stitched into the very fabric of the bayou, as constant as the gnarled cypress roots and the sluggish brown waters winding through the swamp. But this morning carried something else, a strange, unspoken tension that clung to the fields of the Dubois plantation like a stubborn mist. Antoine Broussard shifted his weight, his back protesting from years of unending toil, his hands, hardened and scarred, wrapped around the worn wooden handle of his shovel, polished smooth by calloused palms and repetition. He stood beside a dozen other men at the edge of a freshly cleared stretch of land, their faces streaked with dirt, their bodies already weary, though the day had barely begun. Monsieur Jean-Luc Dubois, master of the plantation, a man whose fortune seemed as deep and murky as the swamps surrounding his estate, had ordered this neglected plot, prepared for planting. For years it had been left wild, tangled with stubborn palmetto and thick creeping vines. Now it was to be subdued. Silas Croft, the overseer, paced before them. He was a narrow man, yet his presence loomed large, his shadow seeming longer than his frame. His voice, roughened by tobacco and constant shouting, cracked through the humid air. "Move along! The sun's not waiting for you to drift in your thoughts." He spat into the dirt, pale eyes scanning the line of workers with cold impatience. "Dig deep. I want this earth turned before sundown." Antoine drove his shovel into the ground. The soil was dark and rich, yielding with a soft sigh. The labor settled into its familiar rhythm. Thrust, lift, turn, cast aside. Grunts and labored breaths blended with the endless drone of cicadas and the distant, lonely call of a heron rising from the marsh. His thoughts drifted to Marie and their small son, Etienne. In the quarters, their smiles were the only warmth he carried with him through the long days. He buried himself in the work, hoping the ache in his muscles might drown out the deeper ache lodged inside his chest. Time blurred. The sun climbed higher, pressing down like a merciless hand. The air grew hotter, thinner. Sweat streamed into Antoine's eyes, distorting the shimmering horizon. The men moved in a line, their shovels rising and falling in grim, mechanical unison. Then a cry shattered the rhythm. Sharp, sudden. Baptiste. The young man stood rigid, his shovel lodged halfway into the earth. His face had gone pale beneath the grime, eyes wide with a terror that seemed to hollow him out from within. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, barely audible. "What is this?" Antoine froze, his own shovel suspended mid-motion. Unease rippled down the line of workers like a silent current. Croft turned instantly, boots crunching across the dry ground as he strode forward. "What's this nonsense?" he barked. "Back to work!" But Baptiste did not move. He only pointed at the ground, his finger trembling. The earth, where his shovel had struck, had not revealed more soil, nor roots, nor stone. Instead, something else had surfaced, something solid, angular. Antoine stepped closer, his heartbeat slowing into a heavy, deliberate thud against his ribs. There, partially uncovered in the trench, lay a dark rectangular shape, too straight, too deliberate. No rock formed like that. No root grew so precisely. Croft shoved Baptiste aside with a grunt. "Out of the way!" He leaned forward, peering into the shallow pit. For a brief moment, the habitual sneer slipped from his face. Something flickered in his pale eyes. Not anger, not annoyance, but something quieter, something uncertain. He nudged the object with the toe of his boot. The sound that answered was dull, hollow. Croft straightened slowly, staring down at the exposed shape. What in God's name is that? Antoine, driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress, knelt beside the hole. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough, decaying wood. It was a coffin, or what remained of one. The wood was old, waterlogged, and crumbling, but its shape was unmistakable. A collective gasp went through the small group of men who had gathered, their shovels now forgotten. "Keep digging carefully," Croft ordered, his voice now devoid of its usual bluster, tinged instead with a strange, almost fearful urgency. "Let's see what else is down there." The men resumed their work, but the rhythm was broken, replaced by a hesitant, almost reverent pace. Each scoop of earth was now performed with a new caution, a silent dread hanging over them. It wasn't long before another dark rectangle emerged, then another and another, a grim, silent procession of forgotten boxes laid out in a disturbingly neat row just beneath the surface of the earth. The sun beat down, but a chill had settled over the field. The cicada's song seemed to grow louder, more insistent, like 1,000 tiny voices whispering secrets. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. Who were these buried here? Why were they hidden without markers, without crosses, without even a simple mound of earth to distinguish their resting places? The Dubois Plantation had a small, well-tended cemetery for its white residents, and a separate, less formal plot for the enslaved, marked by crude wooden crosses that often rotted away within a few seasons. But these were different. These were deliberately concealed, erased from the landscape, as if their very existence was meant to be forgotten. Antoine felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He had lived on this land his entire life, as had his parents and grandparents. He knew every rise and dip, every ancient oak and winding path. Yet, this particular patch of ground, so close to the main house, so seemingly innocuous, had held this secret for years, perhaps decades. The sheer number of them stretching out in a grim line suggested not an isolated incident, but a pattern, a deliberate act of concealment. The air, already heavy with humidity, now felt thick with unspoken history, with the ghosts of those whose names had been swallowed by the earth. Croft, his face now a mask of grim determination, ordered them to continue, but his usual threats were absent. He seemed as unnerved as the men, though he tried to hide it behind a facade of gruff authority. "Just clear the dirt. Don't touch anything else," he commanded, his voice lower than usual. "I'll fetch Monsieur Dubois," as Croft hurried away, his boots kicking up dust. The men worked in a stunned silence. The exposed coffins, their wood dark and decaying, seemed to breathe a silent accusation into the oppressive air. Antoine felt a prickle of fear, a primal instinct warning him that they had stumbled upon something far more sinister than forgotten graves. This was not merely death. This was erasure. And in a place like the Dubois Plantation, erasure often meant something far more terrifying than a simple burial. It meant a story deliberately buried, a truth meant to remain forever hidden beneath the Louisiana soil. The sun continued its relentless climb, but the day had already turned cold, shadowed by the grim discovery beneath their feet, the discovery of the first coffin had been a shock, a jolt to the monotonous rhythm of their lives. But as the morning wore on, and the line of unearthed wooden boxes stretched further, the shock curdled into a profound, unsettling dread. The men, usually quick to jest or complain, worked in a silence so heavy it pressed down on them more than the oppressive heat. Each scrape of a shovel, each thud of earth, seemed to echo the silent accusation rising from the ground. Baptiste, still pale, had been moved to a less sensitive area, his nerves too afraid to continue near the grim row. Antoine, however, found himself unable to look away. He worked methodically, carefully, his eyes constantly drawn to the exposed wood. The coffins were crude, unadorned, clearly not meant for any formal burial. They were simply boxes, hastily constructed, then hastily interred. There were no names carved into the wood, no dates, no symbols of faith, just raw, decaying timber. The Louisiana heat was a living entity, a suffocating presence that clung to their skin, seeped into their clothes, and made every breath a struggle. The air shimmered above the fields, distorting the distant line of cypress trees that marked the edge of the bayou. The scent of damp earth, usually a comforting aroma of fertility, now mingled with a faint cloying odor that Antoine couldn't quite place, but which sent a shiver down his spine. It was the smell of something old, something forgotten, something that had been hidden for too long. "How many?" Antoine whispered Etienne. Not his son, but another young man, barely older than a boy who worked beside him. His voice was hoarse, his eyes darting nervously from one coffin to the next. Antoine didn't answer immediately. He counted in his head a grim tally. 13, he finally said, his own voice a low murmur. 13 so far, Etienne. And the row keeps going. 13. The number itself felt ominous. It wasn't. A family plot, not a small group. This was a deliberate, systematic burial. The sheer scale of it was what truly unsettled them. It spoke of a secret too large to be accidental, too dark to be easily explained. Miss Dubois arrived shortly after Croft had fetched him. His usual crisp linen suit already showing damp patches under the arms despite the early hour. He was a man of imposing stature, his face usually set in an expression of stern authority. But today Antoine noticed a subtle shift. Dubois' eyes, usually sharp and commanding, held a flicker of something akin to apprehension as he surveyed the scene. He walked slowly along the edge of the trench, his gaze sweeping over the exposed coffins, his lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "What is this, Croft?" Dubois' voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that Antoine had rarely heard. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something colder, more calculating. "Unmarked graves, muser," Croft replied, his voice equally subdued. "A whole row of them. We just stumbled upon them clearing the new field." Dubois stopped at the end of the line, his back to the workers. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if searching for answers in the shimmering heat. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the distant croaking of frogs from the bayou. The men held their breath, waiting, watching. They knew that whatever Dubois decided, their lives would be irrevocably touched by this discovery. Finally, Dubois turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Continue digging!" he commanded, his voice regaining some of its usual authority, though it still lacked its customary bite. "But be careful. Do not disturb the contents. I want to know the full extent of this situation." He emphasized the word situation, as if trying to diminish the gravity of what lay before them, and tell no one. Not a word of this leaves this field. Is that understood? His gaze swept over the workers, lingering on Antoine for a fraction of a second longer than on the others. A collective murmur of assent went through the group. They understood. Silence was a currency on the plantation, often bought with fear. As the day progressed, the row of graves grew longer. 14, 15, 16. The count climbed steadily, each new discovery deepening the mystery and the dread. The men worked with a grim efficiency, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. They were no longer just digging, they were unearthing a secret, piece by agonizing piece. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty of the sunset was lost on the men. Their faces were stray with dirt and sweat, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and a growing sense of unease. By the time the last rays of light faded, 21 coffins had been exposed, stretching in a perfectly straight line, a grim testament to some forgotten tragedy. Antoine leaned on his shovel, his muscles screaming in protest, but his mind was racing. He tried to recall any stories, any whispers, any old tales that might explain this. But there was nothing. The older folks sometimes spoke of the old times, of sickness and hardship, but never of anything like this. These were not the haphazard burials of a sudden plague, nor the marked graves of those who simply passed. This was something else entirely. The air grew cooler as darkness descended, bringing with it the chorus of night creatures, crickets, frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The exposed coffins seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, their presence more pronounced, more menacing in the fading light. A heavy mist began to roll in from the bayou, swirling around the men's ankles, lending an ethereal, ghostly quality. Ye to the scene. Croft, his face now etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, dismissed them with a curt nod. "Go get some rest. We'll be back at first light." His voice was flat, devoid of its usual menace. Even he seemed subdued by the day's grim work. As Antoine walked back to the quarters, the image of the 21 unmarked graves burned into his mind. He could still smell the damp earth, the faint clawing odor. He could still feel the weight of the unspoken questions. Who were they? Why were they buried like this? And what secret did their silent resting places hold that Mise Dubois was so desperate to keep hidden? The plantation, usually a place of predictable misery, now felt infused with a new, chilling mystery, a darkness that had been unearthed, along with the forgotten dead. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that this was only the beginning. The ground had given up its dead, but the truth remained buried, waiting to be found. The Dubois plantation, known formerly as Belle Reve, was a sprawling empire of cotton and cane, its prosperity built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children. From the outside, it presented an image of antebellum grandeur, a magnificent white-columned manor house, manicured gardens, and vast fields stretching to the horizon. But beneath this veneer of wealth and civility, Belle Reve harbored a reputation whispered in hushed tones among the enslaved communities of neighboring parishes, a reputation that spoke of more than just the usual hardships of bondage. Jean-Luc Dubois, the current patriarch, had inherited Belle Reve from his father, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. Jean-Luc, however, possessed a colder, more detached cruelty. He was a man of few words, his commands delivered with an icy precision that left no room for argument. He rarely raised his voice, preferring to let Silas, Croft, his overseer, handle the day-to-day brutality. But everyone knew that Croft was merely Dubois' instrument, and the true power, the true chilling authority, resided in the quiet, calculating mind of the master. Whispers about Belle Reve had always circulated, stories of men and women who simply vanished, not sold off to distant plantations, but gone without a trace. A fever, a sudden illness, a runaway attempt gone wrong. These were the official explanations delivered with a dismissive wave of the hand. But the enslaved people knew better. They knew the subtle signs. The way a person's name would suddenly cease to be spoken. The way their meager belongings would disappear from the quarters, not packed for a journey, but simply gone. These disappearances were not frequent enough to cause open rebellion, but they were regular enough to sow a deep, pervasive fear. Antoine had heard these stories since he was a boy. He remembered his grandmother, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, telling him to always keep his head down, to never draw attention to himself. Belle Reve Has hungry shadows, little one, she'd warned, her voice barely a whisper. Shadows that swallow folk whole. He had dismissed them as old wives' tales, the natural fears of a people living under constant threat. But now, with the 21 unmarked graves staring up at him from the earth, those whispers took on a terrifying new resonance. The arrival of Dr. Alistair Finch, several years prior, had added another layer to Belle Reeve's unsettling aura. Dr. Finch was not a local physician. He had arrived from the north, a man of precise manners and an unsettling intensity in his gaze. He was a man of science, Dubois had announced, a scholar dedicated to advancing medical knowledge. He had been given a small, isolated building on the edge of the plantation, far from the main house and the quarters, which he had converted into a sort of clinic or laboratory. At first his presence had been met with a cautious optimism. Perhaps he would bring better care, some relief from the constant ailments that plagued the enslaved population. But that hope quickly faded. Dr. Finch's methods were strange. He rarely treated common fevers or broken bones. Instead, he seemed interested in more obscure conditions, in observations and studies. He would select individuals, often those who were already weakened or ill, and take them to his clinic. Sometimes they would return looking gaunt and distant, their eyes holding a haunted quality. More often, they simply did not return at all. Antoine remembered the case of old Mama Cecile, a woman revered for her knowledge of herbs and healing. She had suffered from a persistent cough, and Dr. Finch had taken her for treatment. She never came back. Dubois had simply announced her passing, attributing it to consumption. But Maman Cecile had been strong despite her age. Her disappearance had left a gaping hole in the community and a chilling question in Antoine's mind. Life on the plantation, despite these underlying currents of fear, followed a brutal, predictable rhythm. Days began before dawn with the ringing of the bell and ended long after sunset. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, their white bowls a deceptive symbol of purity against the backdrop of relentless labor. The air was always thick with the smell of earth, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of sugarcane from a neighboring field. Antoine's days were a blur of physical exertion. He was a strong man, his muscles honed by years of work, but the constant strain took its toll. He worked alongside his fellow enslaved, their shared suffering forging a bond of silent understanding. There was Marie, his wife, who worked in the main house, her days filled with endless chores, her spirit rest. Illiant, despite the indignities she faced. And their son, Etienne, a bright-eyed boy of 5, whose laughter was a rare, precious sound that Antoine clung to. Etienne was too young to understand the full weight of their existence, but Antoine saw the shadows already beginning to gather in his innocent eyes. The quarters, a collection of small, dilapidated cabins, offered little respite. They were crowded, hot, and often damp, but they were home. It was there in the evenings, by the flickering light of a single candle, that the true stories of Belle Reve were exchanged, whispered from mouth to ear, passed down through generations. Stories of cruelty, of injustice, and of the strange, unsettling presence of Dr. Finch. Antoine had always been a man of quiet observation. He watched, he listened, he remembered. He noticed the way Dr. Finch would sometimes walk through the fields, his gaze not on the cotton, but on the workers, a calculating glint in his eye. He noticed the way Dubois would sometimes visit Finch's clinic, their conversations low and secretive. He noticed the way Croft, usually so eager to inflict pain, seemed to avoid the clinic. A flicker of something akin to unease in his usually cold demeanor. The discovery of the unmarked graves had ripped open a wound that had festered beneath the surface of Belle Reve for years. It was not just a historical curiosity. It was a direct, tangible link to the whispered disappearances, to the strange experiments of Dr. Finch. The men who had dug those graves Antoine among them now carried a terrible burden. They had seen what was meant to remain hidden, and that knowledge was a dangerous thing on the Dubois plantation. As Antoine lay on his straw mat that night, the sounds of the quarters, a baby's cry, a low murmur of conversation, the rustle of leaves outside seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of his own heart. He thought of the 21 silent witnesses in the earth, and the faces of those who had vanished. Mammon Cecil, young Thomas, who had suffered from a persistent cough, and others whose names now floated like ghosts in his memory. He knew with a chilling certainty that the truth of Belrève was far darker than any whisper, any rumor, and he, Antoine Broussard, had just become an unwilling participant in its uncovering. The air in the quarters felt heavy, not just with the usual humidity, but with the weight of a secret that threatened to consume them all. The days following the discovery were shrouded in a palpable tension that hung over Belrève like the morning fog. The work in the fields continued, but the men who had unearthed the graves moved with a new, almost fearful circumspection. Their eyes constantly darted towards the newly cleared patch, now a raw, exposed wound in the earth, where the 21 crude coffins lay open to the elements. Miss Dubois, after his initial subdued reaction, had regained his composure, but his orders were clear and chillingly precise. The men were to continue the exhumation, but with extreme care. "I want to know what's in those boxes," he had stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Their testimony was worthless in the eyes of the law. The local authorities, the sheriff, the magistrates, they were all part of the same social fabric, often plantation owners themselves, or beholden to them. Antoine knew that if he were to approach them, he would be dismissed, perhaps even punished for daring to accuse a white man, let alone a man of Dubois' standing and influence. He remembered a story from years ago of a neighboring plantation where an enslaved man had tried to report a brutal beating. The man had been accused of lying, whipped for insubordination, and then sold downriver, never to be seen again. The system was designed to protect itself, to silence any voice that dared to challenge its authority. Antoine also recalled Finch's journal mentioning correspondence with the New Orleans Medical Society and reports submitted to the Southern Medical Journal. This wasn't just a local horror. It was sanctioned, perhaps even encouraged, by the very institutions meant to uphold ethics and knowledge. The thought was sickening. It meant that the science of the era in some dark corners was built upon the suffering of people like him. He began to observe the interactions between Dubois and other prominent figures in the parish. He noticed the frequent visits of Monsieur Bohong, owner of a vast sugar plantation upstream, and Monsieur Decois, a wealthy merchant from New Orleans, who often supplied goods to Belrève. Their conversations with Dubois were always private, held in the study or on the veranda, away from prying ears. Antoine couldn't hear their words, but he saw the knowing glances, the subtle nods, the air of shared understanding that passed between them. Were they involved? Were other plantations also harboring such horrors, or simply turning a blind eye to Dubois' research? The web of corruption seemed to stretch far beyond Belrève. Antoine's attempts to find an ally, a sympathetic ear, were met with fear and resignation. He spoke in veiled terms to a few trusted elders in the quarters, hinting at the nature of the graves. Their responses were always the same: a shake of the head, a sigh, a warning to be careful. Some secrets are best left buried, Antoine. Old man Pierre had advised, his eyes filled with a weary wisdom. The ground holds its own counsel, and sometimes it is safer to let it keep it. But Antoine couldn't. The faces of the victims, the image of the wooden cardinal, haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He saw the fear in Marie's eyes, the innocent joy in Etienne's, and he knew he couldn't set and buy. He had to try. He considered running away, taking Marie and Etienne and seeking help in the north. But the risks were immense. The vast, unforgiving swamps of Louisiana, the slave patrols, the bounty hunters. The chances of success were slim, and the consequences of failure unimaginable. And even if they made it, who would believe his story? A runaway slave accusing a prominent plantation owner and a respected doctor of murder and experimentation. It was a fantasy. The economic and social systems of the South were designed to protect men like Dubois. Their wealth, their status, their very way of life depended on the subjugation of people like Antoine. To challenge them was to challenge the entire edifice of their society. The horror of the unmarked graves was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive sickness. Antoine felt a growing sense of isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in his knowledge and his desperate need for justice. The conspiracy of silence was not just a deliberate act by the powerful. It was also a forced complicity, a survival mechanism for those who had no voice, no power. He began to notice subtle changes in the plantation's atmosphere. Croft, usually quick to anger, seemed more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the workers, as if searching for any sign of dissent or knowledge. Dubois himself made more frequent, unannounced visits to the fields, his gaze lingering on Antoine and the other men who had worked on the graves. The unspoken threat was clear. They were being watched. One evening, a young man named Lucien, who had also helped with the exhumation, was found badly beaten near the edge of the quarters. Croft claimed Lucien had tried to steal food, but everyone knew it was a lie. Lucien had been a quiet, compliant worker. His injuries were severe, a clear message to anyone who might concede. Dare speaking out. Lucien, terrified, refused to say anything, his eyes wide with fear. Antoine understood. The conspiracy of silence was not just about ignoring the truth. It was about actively suppressing it violently if necessary. The horror of the graves was not just in what they contained, but in the lengths to which the powerful would go to keep their secrets buried. He felt the walls closing in, the net tightening. He had uncovered the truth, but now the truth was a dangerous predator, and he, Antoine, was its prey. The bayou, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to whisper warnings, its dark waters reflecting the impenetrable depths of human cruelty and complicity. The beating of Lucien sent a chilling message through the quarters, a stark reminder of the consequences of knowing too much. Fear, already a constant companion, now settled deeper, heavier in Antoine's heart. He knew he was being watched, his every move scrutinized by Croft, and perhaps even by Dubois himself. The air around him felt charged with unspoken threats, a constant hum of danger. Antoine tried to be more cautious, to blend in, to appear as just another laborer. But the knowledge he carried was a burning ember, impossible to extinguish. He saw the faces of the victims in his dreams, heard the silent accusations from the unmarked graves. He couldn't simply forget, couldn't simply go back to the way things were. The direct threats began subtly. One morning, Antoine found his shovel handle deliberately weakened, almost snapping in his hands during work. Another time, a venomous snake, usually shy of human presence, was found coiled near his sleeping mat, a clear warning left by someone. He knew these were not accidents. These were deliberate acts, designed to intimidate, to remind him of his vulnerability. He noticed Dr. Finch's continued presence on the plantation, seemingly undisturbed by the discovery of the graves. The clinic remained active, its shutters closed, its secrets guarded. Antoine sometimes saw figures being led to the clinic, usually at night, their faces obscured by darkness, their steps hesitant. The horror was ongoing, the experiments continuing even as their victims lay unearthed in the field. The sheer audacity, the callous disregard for human life, filled Antoine with a cold rage. The psychological toll on Antoine was immense. He slept little, haunted by nightmares. During the day, he was constantly on edge, his senses hyper-alert, searching for danger in every shadow, every rustle of leaves. He saw the fear reflected in the eyes of Marie, who, though he had not told her the full extent of his discovery, sensed his growing torment. She would hold his hand in the darkness, her touch of fragile comfort against the encroaching dread. He also noticed the subtle changes in the behavior of other enslaved people. Some avoided him, their eyes darting away when he approached, fearing that his dangerous knowledge might infect them. Others, however, looked at him with a silent plea, a desperate hope that he might somehow find a way to expose the truth. He felt the weight of their unspoken expectations, adding to his already heavy burden. One evening, as Antoine was returning from the fields, Croft intercepted him. The overseer's face was grim, his eyes narrowed. "You've been asking too many questions, Broussard," Croft said, his voice a low growl, "poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Mas Dubois doesn't like that. He doesn't like curious minds." Antoine's heart hammered, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I ask no questions, Master Croft," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I only work the fields as I'm told." Croft stepped closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. "Don't play the fool with me. I've seen the way you look at those graves, the way you look at the clinic. You think you know something, don't you?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let me tell you something, Broussard. Some things are best left buried. And those who dig too deep, sometimes they find themselves buried right alongside them, and no one will ever know they were there." The threat was clear, unmistakable. Croft's words were not just his own. They were Dubois. Antoine felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. He was no longer just a witness. He was a target. The next day, a small fire broke out in the quarters dangerously close to Antoine's cabin. It was quickly extinguished, but the message was clear. His life, and the lives of his family, were in direct peril. He looked at Etienne, playing innocently in the dirt, and a fierce, desperate resolve hardened within him. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let this horror continue. He knew he couldn't fight Dubois and Finch directly. He was an enslaved man, powerless in their world. But he had knowledge, and knowledge, even in chains, could be a dangerous thing. He began to think, to plan, to search for a way, however small, to expose the truth. He remembered Finch's journal, the mentions of the New Orleans Medical Society, the Southern Medical Journal. Perhaps there was a way to send a message, a whisper that could grow into a shout beyond the confines of Belle Ref. The bayou, with its dense foliage and winding waterways, offered a slim hope. He had heard stories of messages carried by sympathetic boatmen, of whispers reaching ears far away. It was a desperate gamble, but what other choice did he have? To remain silent was to condemn himself, his family, and countless others to the same fate as those in the unmarked graves. The danger was escalating, the threats growing more explicit, more violent. Antoine felt like a trapped animal, but a spark of defiance, fueled by the memory of the victims and the love for his family ignited within him. He would not be silenced. He would not let their deaths be in vain. The oppressive Louisiana air, thick with humidity and the scent of decay, now also carried the faint, defiant scent of a man pushed to his breaking point, ready to fight for a truth that refused to stay buried. The escalating threats had pushed Antoine to the brink, but they had also sharpened his resolve. He knew he couldn't simply wait for the inevitable. He had to act. His mind, usually focused on the day's labor, now worked with a feverish intensity, piecing together fragments of information, searching for a weakness in the impenetrable wall of silence surrounding Belle Reve. He remembered the specific details from Dr. Finch's journal, the names of the medical societies, the dates of correspondence, the chillingly precise descriptions of the studies. He knew that if he could somehow get this information to the outside world, to someone who might listen, it could be their only hope. His opportunity came during a particularly busy week, when Dubois was away on business in New Orleans, and Croft was preoccupied with a damaged cotton gin. Dr. Finch, however, remained on the plantation, his clinic still a place of dark activity. Antoine, feigning a sudden illness, managed to get himself assigned to lighter duties near the main house, giving him a chance to observe. He noticed a young house servant, a boy named Louis, who occasionally ran errands for Dr. Finch, carrying sealed envelopes to the post office in the nearest town, Bayou Teche. Louis was a quiet, timid boy, but Antoine had seen a flicker of fear in his eyes when he spoke of the clinic. Antoine approached Louis cautiously, offering him a small piece of dried meat he had saved. "Louis," he began, his voice low and gentle, "you carry letters for the doctor?" "Yes." Louis nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes, Antoine. To the post office. Do you ever wonder what is in those letters?" Antoine asked, his gaze steady. Louis hesitated, then whispered, "Sometimes they are always sealed. But the doctor, he is a strange man." Antoine leaned closer. "Louis, I need your help." "It is a dangerous thing, I ask, but it is for the good of us all, for the good of those who have disappeared." He saw the boy's eyes widen further, a dawning comprehension. "I need you to carry a different message, a message that must reach the right hands." He explained in veiled terms the horror of the graves, the experiments, the names he had seen in the journal. He didn't show the boy the journal, but he recounted enough details to make the truth undeniable. Louis listened, his face growing paler and paler, his small body trembling. But, Monsieur Dubois, Master Croft," Louis stammered, fear wearing with a naint sense of outrage. "They will never know it was you," Antoine promised. "I will write the message. You will simply deliver it, as you deliver the doctor's letters. But this one you will give to a specific person, a man named Monsieur Thibodeau, the editor of the Gazette de la Louisiana in New Orleans. He is a man who writes about justice." Antoine had heard whispers of Thibodeau, a rare voice of dissent in the local papers. The risk was immense for Louis, but the boy, perhaps swayed by Antoine's quiet conviction and the sheer horror of the story, finally nodded, his jaw set. "I will do it, Antoine. For Mamos Cecil. For the others." That night, by the flickering light of a stolen candle, Antoine painstakingly wrote his message on a scrap of paper he had found. He wrote of the unmarked graves, the 21 bodies, the evidence of medical experimentation, the names of the victims he remembered from Finch's journal, the complicity of Dubois, and the ongoing nature of the atrocities. He wrote with a desperate urgency, knowing that this was his one chance. He sealed the note with a drop of wax, making it look like any other official correspondence. The next morning, with a pounding heart, Antoine handed the sealed note to Louis, instructing him precisely on how to deliver it. Louis, his face pale but determined, tucked the note deep into his pocket and set off for Bayou Teche. Days passed, each one an eternity of agonizing suspense. Antoine worked, watched, and waited. Every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible sign of discovery. He saw Dr. Finch continue his work, oblivious, or perhaps simply uncaring, that his secrets might be exposed. He saw Dubois return, his usual stern demeanor intact, seemingly unaware of the silent rebellion brewing beneath his very nose. Then, one morning, a carriage arrived at Belle Reve. Not the usual visitors, but a group of stern-faced men in dark suits. Among them, Antoine recognized the figure of Monsieur Thibault, his face grim, his eyes sharp and observant. With him were two other men, one carrying a large ledger, the other a camera, a strange box-like contraption. A cold dread, mixed with a surge of desperate hope, washed over Antoine. His message had reached its destination. The men confronted Dubois, their voices low but firm. Antoine, working nearby, strained to hear. He caught fragments, unmarked graves, allegations of medical malpractice, human experimentation, official inquiry. Dubois' face, usually so composed, was a mask of disbelief and then cold fury. He denied everything, of course, dismissing the claims as outrageous lies from disgruntled Negroes. He tried to intimidate them, to use his influence. But these men were different. They were not local authorities. They were from New Orleans, representing anent public interest in justice, spurred by Thibodeau's relentless pursuit of truth. The men, Incy, stared on inspecting the clinic and the graves. Dubois, cornered, had no choice but to comply. They went to the field where the 21 graves lay exposed, a silent, damning testament. They opened the crude coffins, and the men from New Orleans, their faces growing pale, saw the horrifying evidence for themselves. The disarticulated bones, the crude instruments, the stained shrouds. The camera flashed, capturing the grim reality. Then they went to Dr. Finch's clinic. Finch, initially defiant, quickly crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the stern questioning. The ledger-carrying man, a representative from the New Orleans Medical Society, found Finch's journal the very one Antoine had read. The entries, once chillingly clinical, now read like a confession of unspeakable crimes. The full scope of the horror was laid bare. The systematic nature of the experimentation, the sheer number of victims, the callous disregard for their lives, all under the guise of scientific advancement. The final revelation was not a single moment, but a cascade of horrifying truths. The men from New Orleans discovered that Finch had indeed been submitting reports, albeit heavily sanitized ones, to various medical journals, and had even received some minor accolades for his innovative research. The medical establishment, in its pursuit of knowledge, had at best turned a blind eye, and at worst tacitly encouraged these atrocities. The victims were not just those buried in the field. They were also the countless others whose suffering had been dismissed, whose humanity had been denied, all in the name of a twisted science. Antoine watched from a distance, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Antoine watched as Dubois' face twisted, not merely with anger, but with something far more fragile: fear, the expression of a man witnessing the slow collapse of the world he had so carefully constructed. Ted, the mask of authority, slipped, revealing the panic beneath. Beside him stood Dr. Finch, once composed and methodical, now stripped of his clinical detachment. His posture had crumbled. His sharp eyes darted wildly, no longer calculating but cornered, the desperate gaze of a trapped animal. What had been buried in secrecy had erupted into the open, not as rumor or suspicion, but as undeniable truth. It surged upward like a violent geyser, carrying with it the stench of unspeakable acts. For a fleeting moment, Antoine felt something close to triumph. The silence had been broken. The dead had been forced into the light. But even in that moment, a colder understanding settled over him. Exposure was not the same as justice. In a world built upon inequality so deep it shaped the very soil, truth alone rarely won. The struggle was far from finished. When the men from New Orleans arrived, summoned by Antoine's desperate message, the illusion surrounding Belle Reve Plantation shattered almost overnight. The estate's rigid, suffocating routine gave way to chaos. Officials moved through the grounds. Doors were sealed. Questions were demanded. Dr. Finch was taken into custody. His clinic was closed, his journals seized, his surgical instruments catalogued as evidence. Dubois himself avoided immediate arrest, but endured relentless interrogation. His name, once spoken with respect among New Orleans' elite, became a subject of suspicion. The Gazette de la Louisiana published a blistering exposé detailing the discovery of the 21 unmarked graves and the horrors recorded in Finch's writings. The revelations rippled through the parlors and drawing rooms of New Orleans society, sending shock through those who had long admired Belle Reve from a comfortable distance. For a brief, fragile stretch of time, hope stirred within Antoine's chest. Perhaps the dead would finally be honored. Perhaps the living would be spared further suffering. But justice in 1850, Louisiana did not move swiftly, and for men without power, it often did not move at all. The outrage that initially burned so brightly began to dim. In its place grew something quieter and more deliberate: damage control. Dubois, fortified by wealth and influence, began tightening the invisible strings that bound the region's institutions. Authorities who had seemed bold in the beginning grew hesitant. The narrative shifted. Dr. Finch, it was claimed, had acted alone, a rogue physician, unstable and unhinged. His experiments were portrayed as the erratic obsessions of a disturbed mind, not crimes enabled by patronage and protection. Dubois, according to this revised account, had been deceived, an unfortunate benefactor misled by a man of science. The 21 graves were not honored. They were not memorialized. They were quietly reburied. The soil was smoothed over once more, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Official records disappeared or were altered. The names that had briefly resurfaced from Finch's journals were swallowed again by silence. Even the small wooden cardinal, the child's toy unearthed beside one tiny skeleton, was placed back into the earth, its silent defiance hidden once more. Finch's trial was swift and hushed. He was not convicted of murder. Instead, he was found guilty of unethical medical conduct and causing public disorder. His punishment was mild, a few years confined to a state asylum, a convenient solution. It discredited him as mad rather than monstrous. Within a handful of years, rumors drifted through the region that he had been released or had vanished. Some claimed he had traveled west, where identities dissolved easily into the vastness of frontier towns. Dubois faced no legal consequences. He paid a substantial sum to the New Orleans Medical Society to quiet the embarrassment and gradually resumed his affairs. His reputation bore scars, but his power remained largely intact. The whispers surrounding Belle Reve faded back into rumor. Antoine's part in exposing the truth was never publicly acknowledged. Louis, the young house servant who had dared to help, was quietly sold to a distant plantation, a warning wrapped in silence. Antoine himself was not whipped or imprisoned. That would have drawn attention. Instead, punishment took subtler forms. Croft's cruelty sharpened. Antoine was assigned the most grueling tasks: dangerous repairs, relentless field labor beneath the harshest sun. His food portions diminished almost imperceptibly. His family lived under constant unspoken threat. No visible scars marked him, but the torment was relentless, psychological, grinding, designed to erode him slowly rather than break him all at once. He endured. But endurance is not the same as wholeness. The images of the graves, the hollow sound of shovel against coffin wood, the knowledge of what had been done, all of it followed him. The injustice cut deeper than any lash. He looked at Marie, her face lined now with quiet fear. He watched Etienne grow taller, clinging to the fragile spark of childhood innocence. Antoine guarded that innocence fiercely. He taught his son to observe carefully, to remember, to speak cautiously, and above all, to understand that the world around him was not built on fairness. The graves beneath the cultivated field were forgotten by most, but not by Antoine. He knew exactly where they lay. He understood that the true horrors were not ghosts or spirits lurking in the bayou's mist. They were men, and the systems that shielded them. Years passed. Cotton continued to flourish at Belle Reve. The grand manor house stood tall and polished. The bayou flowed on, indifferent and slow. But for those who remember, the land itself carried a different history. Beneath its ordered rows rested 21 souls denied names, denied dignity, denied justice. Their story lingered in the rustling cane, in the lonely cry of herons, in the suffocating Louisiana heat, a reminder that some horrors, once unearthed, cannot truly be buried again, not in the hearts of those who witnessed them. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all was this: Belle Reve's graves were unlikely to be unique. They were simply the ones that, for one brief and terrible moment,